On October 18th, Calgarians are going to have the opportunity to decide what the next 4 years of our city's future looks like. And the reason for that is the next municipal election is being held on October 18th. I'm running in that election, and I'm running to be the next city councillor for Ward 3. Today, I'd like to take just a few minutes to tell you who I am, why I'm running, and what I want to see happen in Ward 3 and in Calgary. I believe that it's very important that people should know as much as possible about the background of the person that they're considering voting for. So I want to take just a couple of minutes to tell you a little bit more about who I am and what my background is. I was actually born in Edmonton, but I only lived there for a very short time before my family moved up to northern Alberta in a little town called Fairview, Alberta. I spent most of my childhood there before I moved down to Calgary when I was around 11 or 12, and I've lived in Calgary ever since. I'm incredibly grateful for all of the opportunities that Calgary has provided me and my family over the last 3 decades. When we first moved to Calgary, I started going to school in Northwest Calgary, but I actually ended up graduating from Western Canada High School in downtown Calgary. After that, I wanted to pursue a career as a police officer, but because I'm colorblind, I wasn't able to follow that through all the way, although I did get through a couple of years of the criminology program at Mount Royal University. After I realized that because I was colorblind, I wasn't going to be able to be a police officer, I then started to look at other opportunities, and I actually ended up landing about a 10-year career in business and management. That was after studying business management and business communications as well. It was about 12 years ago, though, that in a conversation with my wife, I realized that I wanted to do more for more people, and she was actually the one who recommended that I study to become a paramedic. So for the last 12 years, I'm extremely proud and extremely grateful that I've been able to serve the people of Calgary working as a paramedic, and I've been on the front lines for some of the largest events that Calgary has seen. I was one of the first responders that was evacuating people during the floods, and I'm incredibly grateful that I had the opportunity to go up to Fort Mac when the fires were going on and support other first responders by providing mental health supports. That's sort of my professional career, but I've also had quite a bit of experience in politics. In 2019, I ran for the Alberta Party in the constituency of Calgary Northeast because I believed that Albertans deserved an option that wasn't just super progressive and it wasn't just super conservative. I'm a person who fundamentally believes in balance, and I wanted to make sure that Albertans had the opportunity to vote for that. As part of that journey, though, I gained a whole lot of experience working with different boards and working with different committees, and I actually wrote several policies that were adopted at the grassroots level that were designed at making Albertans' lives better. And I'm very proud of that, and I'm very grateful for that experience. It's all of that I want to bring to the table to make sure that the constituents of Ward 3 have somebody that they can trust, somebody that they know is going to work in their best interests, and somebody that they know has experience working on policy in the real world to make sure that the decisions that City Council makes are actually making Calgarians' lives better. One of the biggest reasons why I've decided to run to be the next city councillor for Ward 3 is because one of the biggest things that I keep hearing from people over and over again is they don't feel like they can trust their elected representatives. That's a real problem, and it's a real problem for the overall state of our democracy, because if people can't trust the people that they're electing to represent them, they don't actually feel like they're being represented, and that undermines the whole system. I want to change that, and I'm doing the work to actually change that. Some of the things that I've been doing throughout my campaign to make sure that people know that I'm not just saying words, I actually mean the things that I'm talking about. I've been disclosing all of my donations since day one. I was the first candidate to do that. I held off on door knocking at the start of my campaign because I heard from constituents that they weren't comfortable with door knocking while COVID was peaking. And when COVID started to peak again, I was the first candidate to publicly state that I was going to be suspending door knocking out of respect for my constituents, because I believe that a big part of the role of an elected official isn't just to spend all of their time talking about themselves, it's to be listening. One of the other frustrations that I've heard from a lot of constituents in Ward 3 is it seems like every municipal election there's a whole bunch of candidates that pop up that have never really played any role in their community. I'm very proud of the fact that that is absolutely not the case with me. When my wife and I moved to Ward 3 12 years ago, we immediately started to get more involved in our community. I'm proud of the fact that we're raising our family here, and that gives me a big investment in making sure that Ward 3 becomes one of the best places to live in Calgary, if not the best. I've advocated for the new high school, and I'm extremely happy that the provincial government has finally seen fit to make sure that that high school gets built after people having to wait literally for decades for that to happen. I'm also proud of the fact that I've got a long history of volunteering inside the community. I've piloted snow angel programs to make sure that seniors and people who have difficulty moving around or people who have disabilities have their walks cleared so that it's safe for them to be able to get in and out of their houses. I've been a director on the Northern Hills Community Association, working within the community to make sure that the people who live inside of Ward 3 have the best possible communities that they can to live in. And I've also done with my family a lot of other things to make sure that people's lives are as rich as possible in Ward 3. Some of those things include things like making sure that there's a little free pantry available so that people who are dealing with food insecurity have places that they can go without any shame to make sure that they can feed their families. My family also runs a little free library right outside of our house that people have been taking advantage of and enjoying for years now. This is the kind of commitment that I think every single person in Ward 3 should be demanding from their next city councillor, and it's absolutely the kind of commitment that I'm bringing to the table. Now, I talked earlier on about how important it is to me that people can trust their elected officials. And a big part of building that trust is making sure that people know exactly where I stand on issues. So I want to take just a couple of minutes to run down through a few issues so that you know exactly where I stand. One of the biggest concerns that I've heard from people in Ward 3 has to do with economic recovery. I've done a couple of other videos where I've talked about how important it is to support small business. The reality is, Calgary and Ward 3 in particular have had to deal with a double punch to the economy, which comes not only from the economic downturn in oil and gas and the inevitable transition that we're going to have to go through in our economy, but we've also had to deal with the economic impact of COVID. I want to make sure that we have a recovery that includes everybody, and a big part of that means listening to the people who are trying to do business here in Calgary. An important thing that many people don't realize is that 90% of all business that gets done in Calgary is actually done by small businesses. And this is where it's so important that council needs to make sure that they're listening to the owners and operators of those small businesses so we can make sure that we're not just prescribing solutions, we're actually bringing solutions to the table that are going to make things better. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is the Green Line. There's been a lot of conversation about the Green Line, and there's no question that Ward 3 needs much, much better supports for transit. The actual reality is Ward 3 has the highest ridership of transit in the entire city of Calgary. And unfortunately, we haven't had the train that we've been promised for decades. Now, with the current Green Line plan that's been brought to the table, we're not going to have a train anytime soon. This is one of the reasons that I've been advocating for a BRT Max line that'll go up Center Street into Harvest Hills and then up into Livingston so that people will have transit that's available to them, that's reliable to them, so they can get not only to the downtown core, but all the other places that they need to go, like post-secondary institutions, shopping institutions, and travel destinations. One of the other things that I believe that city councillors need to do a much better job of is the simple act of communicating with constituents. This is one of the big reasons why we've seen a lot of sort of hotbed issues pop up that really didn't need to be hotbed issues. It's because they were poorly communicated by city councillors and people didn't understand what was going on. So when they heard about what they thought were major changes, they got rightfully scared. It doesn't need to be that way. And if a city councillor spends more time communicating effectively with their constituents, we can avoid a lot of those problems. It's one of the reasons why one of the things that I want to bring to the table are regular town halls, be it online or in person, depending on what the state of our healthcare system is like. But it's also another one of the reasons why I'm going to continue, once it's safe to, I'm going to continue door knocking and meeting with constituents for the entire length of my term if I'm fortunate enough to be elected. One of the other things that we need to do a much better job is addressing the fact that the City of Calgary does have a role not only in addressing climate change in regards to how it runs its business units, but it also has a responsibility to show some real leadership. This is one of the reasons why I'm advocating for all business units within the City of Calgary to be net zero by 2050. Now, NMAX has already made that commitment, but it needs to be every single business unit moving towards that net zero goal by 2050, and I would love to see that goal get hit sooner. One of the other things that I'd like to see is all of the vehicles in the City of Calgary fleet move towards electric vehicles, because if NMAX goes net zero, then that means that all of that energy that's being produced is no longer going to be energy that's produced using relatively dirty sources. It's going to be energy that's clean energy going into electric cars that aren't producing carbon. There's a whole lot that the City of Calgary can do to address our carbon footprint, but there's a whole lot that we can do to show real leadership, not just in the province of Alberta, but to the entire world, because that's what Calgary does. One of the other concerns that I've heard a lot about from constituents of Ward 3 has to do with pedestrian safety, and it has to do with the walkability of our communities. The reality is that most of our communities weren't designed with walkability in mind, they were designed with traffic in mind. And unfortunately, a lot of the traffic wasn't even designed all that well. So this is one of the areas that we need to take a step back from and try to figure out some ways that we can make our communities more walkable, and that we can make sure that, especially around areas like schools, the traffic flow is being done in a way that's safe, and so that our kids don't have to worry about simply crossing a street to get to their school or to get to their park. Speaking of parks, that's another area that I'm very, very committed to. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of the parks in Ward 3 are getting close to their end of life. I want to make it very clear that I support organizations like Creating Coventry, who are doing amazing grassroots consultation to make sure that they get the funding to replace those aged out parks with something that the community is going to be able to enjoy, and something that the community is going to be able to use. One of the other issues that kind of dovetails in with that as well is the question of public art. Now, I want to be very, very clear. I am a huge supporter of public art, and I absolutely believe that one of the big things that's attracting businesses to Calgary has to do with our quality of life, and public art absolutely contributes to that. But one of the frustrations that we've heard from a lot of Calgarians is the fact that too many of our art projects are being contracted out to international artists that doesn't keep any money in Calgary, and worst of all, it doesn't support the incredible arts community that we have here in Calgary. If I'm elected as Ward 3 City Councillor, I can commit right now that I will be making sure that as much money as possible goes towards local artists, not international artists that are never even going to see the pieces that they've installed here. One of the biggest issues of concerns, though, that I keep hearing from the constituents of Ward 3 has to do with how the City of Calgary collects money and then how they spend it. One of the hot button issues has to do with city councillors' pensions, who are often referred to as golden pensions. Now, I want to be very, very clear. I think that the pension program needs to be completely redesigned. One of the things that the province of Alberta recognized several years ago was that having a pension for an elected official who only serves 4 to 8 years doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it puts the taxpayers on the hook for a very long period of time. One of the things that the province did was they moved towards RRSP contributions, and that's something that I believe that the City of Calgary should absolutely be looking at. I do believe that city councillors deserve to be compensated for their time and all the work that they do, but I don't think that taxpayers need to be on the hook for the rest of that councillor's life. One of the other things that keeps coming up is the question of property taxes. Now, I've made it clear publicly in other places as well that I do not believe that property taxes should be increased. One of the fundamental things that I keep hearing from people is they want to see more business and more people come to Calgary instead of continuing to leave Calgary, and stable property taxes are a big part of that. So I've made the public commitment that I will not vote for any property tax increases until we have a conversation with the province. One of the things that many people don't realize is that 40% of the revenue that gets collected by the City of Calgary actually gets clawed back and used by the province. We're going through a period of incredible economic turmoil right now, and this is why I believe that it's absolutely critical that we try to have a conversation with the province about decreasing that 40% to something more manageable so that Calgary can get back on its feet. One of the other issues that I've heard a lot of concern from the constituents of Ward 3, but across all of Calgary, is the fact that we are seeing more and more people who are experiencing homelessness and houselessness. And we're seeing it up here in Ward 3. There's a lot of homeless and houseless people who are migrating north of the core because they're looking for places that they're going to feel safe at. We're seeing more and more panhandlers who are having to panhandle at intersections, even in Country Hills and Coventry Hills, in order to try to buy food and to just make sure that they can make it through a day. I'm a big believer that we can actually do a whole lot to address homelessness and houselessness. Traditionally, our approach in the city of Calgary has largely been to warehouse people, and that doesn't do anything to address the underlying problems. We also need to do a lot more to address the mental health concerns and the mental health situations that lead people into homelessness and houseless situations. And I think that by making people safe and giving them places to stay, like micro houses, goes a long way to getting us to a place where we can address those underlying situations, because we need to do a much better job of supporting mental health here in the city of Calgary. One of the other questions that comes up a lot that's kind of related to that is the whole question of defunding the police. I want to be absolutely clear. I am not in favor of decreasing any funding to the Calgary Police. The reality is we're seeing in a lot of areas of the city, crime is actually on an increase, and we're seeing a lot more complex kind of crime. But what that means is that the type of policing that we need to do in Calgary needs to evolve and it needs to improve. We shouldn't be sending 2 police officers to somebody who's experiencing a mental health crisis. We should be expanding programs like PACT, where you see a mental health nurse responding to those situations with a police officer. There's a lot of things that we can do to make sure that policing in Calgary becomes much more effective, so that we can make sure that our communities are safer places to be, and more importantly, the people who are experiencing crisis are getting the supports that they need and they deserve. Just a couple of other topics left that I want to try to address. One of the big conversations that's been going on for the last year in Calgary has to do around the whole idea of urban sprawl. Now, I want to be very, very clear. We have a real problem in Calgary where historically we have built communities to try to expand our tax base, but we haven't provided the necessary infrastructure for those communities. So in order to get the funds to do that, we then build more communities, and we've got ourselves into this self-perpetuating feedback loop where we're not actually going back and finishing the communities the way that we were supposed to. We've seen this happen in Ward 3 since it was a thing. There's no shortage of infrastructure deficits that we deal with here in Ward 3, whether we're talking about transportation, whether we're talking about parks, whether we're talking about road improvements, whether we're talking about snow removal. There's a lot of things that we could be doing a whole lot better. But in order to address those things, we have to stop chasing our tail. I'm by no means advocating for huge increases in densification in areas where it's not appropriate. I'm advocating for it in areas where the buildings and the houses that exist there are reaching their end of life and they're not going to be usable by anyone anymore. It's also really important to realize that in any sort of development, there's always a consultation process. And this brings us back to the communication piece, because I absolutely believe that it's a city councilor's job to make sure that the constituents in the areas that they're working in are communicating when those changes are going to happen, so people aren't surprised like we saw in the Harvest Hills golf course. The last issue that I want to address has to do with the question of whether or not we should add fluoride to the water supply. I totally understand and appreciate that there are a lot of people on both sides of this debate who are extremely passionate about it. But I'm committed to transparency, and in order to demonstrate that, I want to make my personal position very clear, but I also want to make my position, if I'm elected to council, very clear. As an individual, I'm a supporter of fluoride. I believe that especially for kids who are living below the poverty line, it does a lot to help prevent tooth decay, and it does a lot to help improve their overall quality of life, because they don't have to deal with all of the dental issues that they're currently having to deal with without having fluoride in the water. So as an individual, I will be voting to add fluoride to the water supply. That being said, the decision that this council, the current council, has made is that this is a decision that should be made by Calgarians, and I will support that decision 100%. So regardless of what my personal beliefs are, when the decision comes before council, I will absolutely vote in line with the vote that's cast by the constituents of Ward 3 on October 18th. Like I said at the beginning, I'm a firm believer that one of the biggest responsibilities and biggest jobs of the next city councillor for Ward 3 is going to be to earn the trust of the voters and the constituents of Ward 3. I've already started doing that work. That's why I'm disclosing all of my donations. That's why I've put my entire resume up on my website. And that's why I've decided to suspend door knocking at a time where I've heard from an overwhelming number of constituents that now is not the time. But that means that I have to work that much harder in order to answer your questions and in order to hear what your concerns are. So my ask of all of you is that if you have any questions, if you have any concerns for the communities that we live in, please reach out to me and let me know, because I want to make sure that when I'm elected to be the next city councillor of Ward 3, I'm doing the job that everybody needs me to do, and I'm doing it properly. My name is Nate Pike, and I'm ready to be your next city councillor for Ward 3.